Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the state of our union is watching the evidence pile up. We begin this morning with some breaking news. The lawyer for the first whistleblower now tells me he is also representing a second whistleblower who has spoken to the Intelligence Community Inspector General. The news, first reported by ABC, is another development that could play into the impeachment inquiry into President Trump. And it's just the latest in a stream of new evidence this week, backing up the original whistleblower complaint against President Trump, including notably the president's own public call for not only Ukraine, but for China to investigate his potential 2020 rival. But perhaps most damning, House Democrats have obtained text messages between three senior U.S. officials discussing what looks like a quid pro quo, an office of X in exchange for Y with Ukraine, including this exchange. Quote, heard from White House, assuming President Zelensky convinces Trump he will investigate, quote, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for visit to Washington. Or this text from a senior U.S. diplomat in Ukraine. Quote, as I said on the phone, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. We should note, we invited the White House on to answer questions on the show this morning. They did not offer a guest. We also invited both of the president's personal lawyers, Rudy Giuliani and Jay Sekulow. They declined to appear. We invited every member of Senate leadership and the top House Republicans. They all declined or did not even respond. The Trump White House no longer holds regular press briefings or any press briefings at all. And so on one of the most critical news weeks of the last 3 years, here are just three of many questions that we feel need to be answered. One, why did senior U.S. diplomats believe that U.S. military aid was being withheld as a tool to pressure Ukraine to announce an investigation into the Bidens and into attempts to undermine the Mueller investigation? Two, can this White House name another instance, just one, in which President Trump personally pushed a foreign leader to investigate an American citizen who was not one of his political opponents? Three, would you think it entirely appropriate for a Democratic president to use the power of his or her office to demand foreign governments conduct investigations into Republicans and their families? As always, the invitation for an official to answer these questions stands. Here with me now to talk about this are two Republicans who are speaking out and challenging President Trump for the Republican presidential nomination. Former Congressman Mark Sanford and former Congressman Joe Walsh. Congressman Sanford, let me start with you. The president called for both Ukraine and China to investigate Biden. He did that publicly. We saw new text showing U.S. diplomats pushing the Ukrainians to announce a probe if they wanted a White House meeting. A U.S. diplomat expressed concerns that military aid was being withheld, awaiting that announcement for an investigation into the Bidens. You have said the impeachment inquiry is justified. Would you vote to support such an inquiry if you were in the House of Representatives?
I don't know. I suspect so. Again, I think we need to take this incrementally. I mean, I think to your point, there ought to be a vote before we go into the inquiry. If you look at the last three impeachments, and in fact one in which I actually took the vote, you formalize the process as opposed to having an open-ended process, which is the route that Pelosi is taking right now.
But so you're not sure that you would vote for it?
In terms of inquiry?
Yeah, the inquiry.
I would take the vote in terms of inquiry. I ultimately, as I've said previously, I don't know that ultimately impeachment's the best way to go. I think probably censure is, given the fact that we're this close to an election, but that's a larger conversation. Would I want to investigate this? Yes.
Congressman Walsh, what do you say?
I don't understand that. With all due respect, Mark, this president deserves to be impeached. Jake, nobody from the White House and no high-level Republicans are on this show today because there's nothing to defend. This president betrayed his country again this week. Would I vote, if I were in Congress, on the inquiry? There's enough we know now to vote to impeach this president. He stood on the White House lawn this week, Jake, and told two additional foreign governments to interfere in our election. That alone is impeachable. This is a strong term I'm going to use, but I'm going to say it on purpose. Donald Trump is a traitor. Now, I know there's a lot of talk about treason, right? People on both sides, Jake, have been irresponsible using that word treason. I'm not accusing this president of treason. Our founders were very specific as to what treason is. But when you look at traitor more broadly defined, This president betrayed our country again this week. And it's not the first time he did it. Excuse me, I don't know that we should move forward incrementally. This president needs to be impeached, Jake, just based on what he himself has said. And Republicans better get behind that.
Congressman Sanford?
I respectfully disagree. In other words, the nature of a process is not to come to the conclusion at the beginning of it. And so for people to just step out and say he needs to be impeached is to actually diminish and discard with the very process that's laid out by founding fathers. And so I do think we ought to be incremental. Are there very troubling charges out there? Yes. Do they need to be investigated? Yes. But to jump to conclusion, say he needs to be impeached, what he's done is treasonous, is to say we're not going to go through the very process that the founding fathers laid out.
Well, Jake, you go through the process. But again, Mark, with all due respect, the President of the United States, and this is not the first time he's done it, is telling foreign governments to interfere in our election. And here's another thing. He asked China this week to investigate his fellow Americans. If that alone, and that's what our founders feared, Jake, Mark, if that alone isn't impeachable, then nothing is. Yes, begin the process.
Let's begin with the end in mind, which is, again, are there troubling charges? Yes. Could you make the argument that you are making? Yes. But do you think you can get 20 Republican senators to go along with that argument? The answer is no. That's why David Brooks wrote an eloquent column last week saying that while there was certainly reason to move forward, it didn't make it politically prudent, because ultimately an impeachment query is not a legal query. It's not in the judiciary. It's a political move. And so the question in this political season is, do we want to completely wipe out the Democratic debate that's taking place amongst the Democrats and some degree of a Republican debate that we're trying to have, Joe, as to what we believe as a country, where we want to go, what's important to us? Because the giant sucking sound will be this impeachment query sucking every other piece of debate, both in Washington and outside Washington, at the door. And the question is, from an elitist standpoint, should 100 senators make the call on whether or not this president stays in office, or should we, in fact, have that query come next November? I think that's legitimate, and I think that there's precedent here. Andrew Jackson in 1834 was censured, and again, it said, we're not going to say nothing, but we don't know that we can actually pull off a change, therefore we're going to let the people decide.
I just want to get some clarity, Congressman Sanford. Do you worry at all about a precedent where it is acceptable for a president to use the power of his office to pressure foreign leaders, especially of countries that really need U.S. help, like Ukraine, to pressure them to investigate rivals? Because if that precedent is acceptable, and I hear people in the president's camp saying that's okay, sure, do you worry about that? Because that doesn't just end with the Trump presidency. It goes on forever, right?
Right. I completely agree with you. Let me be 100% clear. I don't think it's right. End of story. The question is, what do you do about it? And that's a more complex question, which is, do you look at censure? Do you look at impeachment? What does impeachment entail? This is where it's worth everybody reading David Brooks' column of last week, because, again, he argues articulately that what's done here is wrong, but the question is, what do you do about it? And that's where it does become more complex. Do I want to set this precedent? No.
And again, politics be damned, being politically prudent be damned, Jake.
Yeah.
We have a president who stood in front of his country and said, I want a foreign government interfering in our election. That can't be accepted. That's wrong. That's impeachable on its face.
I want you to respond. I want to play some sound.
No, but what you don't want to do, what you don't want to do is give Trump the reason to be able to say, I was absolved of guilt. That will set more precedent going forward than doing something like a censure. Because if you don't come up with the 20 Republican senators on the Senate side Guess what? He's not impeached. And therefore, you do set precedent going forward on, again, what he did. And guess it must be okay. He got cleared by the Senate. He wasn't impeached.
I
think it is worse
Mark, that's
politically.
Washington, D.C. gobbledygook. That's either the Republican Party stands up now and says, no, either the Republican Party stands up now and says, we oppose this. We oppose collusion. We oppose foreign governments interfering in our election. Either we stand up with one unifying voice with that right now, Mark, and we don't get involved in the gobbledygook of censure or impeachment, or is it politically prudent? How about we Republicans do what is right, sir?